Hi guys, I'm Jasha from FTR. Today we have with us Dr. JP Narayan. The Supreme Court recently struck down electoral bonds for being violative of Article 19 of the Constitution. So you have been heavily involved in the legislation process on political funding and the reforms in India. What are your views on electoral bonds and what do you think are the likely consequences of this judgment?
No, Jasha, first of all, judgment is welcome because nobody who is right minded in a democracy will want secret funding of political parties. After all, if people seek to be our representatives, contest elections, if parties want to represent our aspirations and develop an agenda, give us alternatives in terms of policy as well as individuals to occupy positions of office, they should be accountable to us. We should know what's happening. We should know who is funding them. We should know what decisions they're making. We should know why they're making those decisions. So it's axiomatic that in a democracy, funding through political parties must be transparent. You don't require to invoke the Constitution or fundamental rights. It's a straightforward proposition within democracy. Because the people, the voters, are the principals. The political parties and the candidates are the agents. The agent cannot conceal from the principal. That is the ground on which I have argued even at the time of the Right to Information Act that the political parties have to be brought under Right to Information Act, and we brought them indirectly. Because this 2003 law created a framework in which the parties' contributions by individuals or companies to parties are tax exempt. That is indirect political funding. So automatically Right to Information Act is attracted.
Yes, sir.
So it is self-evident that without even invoking the Constitution or fundamental rights, the parties have to be transparent in their funding. They cannot non-disclose to people. That is self-evident. Therefore, this case, it was very clear that no other judgment is possible except this. And to that extent, we should welcome it. But it does not really solve the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is unaccounted funding.
Yes, sir.
And if, let's say, 5,000 crores is seen as the funding of political parties, a ballpark estimate shows that maybe 1 lakh crores is what actually the parties are spending in that election cycle of 5 years for the state and national elections. So we are only discussing this 5,000 crores. We are forgetting the 95,000 crores, which actually is going into the political campaigns and vote buying and a lot of other nefarious activities. So that doesn't really solve the problem. The second is, as you said, I was very much involved in the framing of this law. It all started with Tehelka scam. Tehelka, for this generation, some of the young people may not be familiar, they captured on video, on camera, some of the cash transactions where people in positions of influence and power collected money in cash, unaccounted, without a receipt or something. In return, the allegation or the suspicion is that they gave favors. And therefore, there was a lot of stink in the country at that time. So on behalf of the FDR and Lok Sabha, I decided that we should utilize this as an opportunity to further the reform a little bit. It will not transform anything big, but at least one step at a time. Political parties need legitimate money. To brand them all bad or abuse them, vilify them is not an answer. Legitimate politics is very costly. You have to develop an agenda, you have to run an office, you have to reach out to people, you have to campaign, you have to do research. A lot of work is you have to travel. And if politics is a noble endeavor, and I've always believed that politics is a noble endeavor, true politics is truly noble, then that noble endeavor should be funded for legitimate activities. When you don't have a legitimate funding window available, then illegitimate funding becomes inevitable, or at least unaccounted funding. You have to collect cash to run the political party's affairs. And if you are in a position of power, the moment you collect cash, whether that cash has colored your judgment and decisions or not, the suspicion that it might have colored your judgment is inevitable. Quid pro quo,
Yes, sir.
suspicion is inevitable.
Yes.
And in many cases, that's also true. Therefore, I went to every single major political leader in power and out of power at that time, including former Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao, an elder statesman. Pranab Mukherjee, who was a senior ranking Congress leader at the time, later became President of India. Dr. Manmohan Singh, who was the Rajya Sabha opposition leader of Congress at the time. Then Mrs. Sonia Gandhi. Then Mr. Arun Jaitley, who was the law minister at that time. Mr. L.K. Advani, who was the presiding deity of BJP, though he was not the president of the party, he was the supremo of the party at that time. And many others across it. George Fernandez, defense minister, who was actually accused of one of the transactions in the Tehelka scam. So many people, I'm only mentioning some of them. And I told them, look, let's rise above parties. You all fight in parliament about the Tehelka scam, abuse each other, shout at each other. It's normal democratic politics in India. But let's use this as an opportunity to raise political funding for legitimate purposes, so that you can honestly raise money without odium or insult for legitimate activities. And they all embraced it immediately. And that's how we brought about a consensus. At our request, the Congress party constituted a committee headed by Dr. Manmohan Singh to look at party finances. Dr. Singh's report was exactly what we wanted. We discussed in detail and all that, so the report was given. The governing NDA coalition accepted the Congress party's internal committee reports in toto. It's probably never happened in the history, at least in the last 40, 50 years after the 1970s. I don't recall a single instance when the governing party and the government accepted the report of an internal committee of an opposition party. It's unheard of. At that time, it actually happened. See, there was consensus possible in the country.
Yes, sir.
And ultimately, Mr. L.K. Advani and Arun Jaitley embraced it. And the 2003 law, Election and Other Related Amendments Act, was enacted. To change the Representation of People Act, some amendments were made. More important, income tax amendments, company law amendments, because at our urging, the law provided at that time for 100% tax exemption to the donors for political funding for any registered political party. Individual, there's no limit, any amount. A company can't simply give a fund to a political party. It's a shareholder's money. Therefore, we said at that time, net average profit of 3 years, 5%. And that was the law. Later, I think it was made 7.5% in case of companies, etc. The other thing that I argued at the time is because the country is moving slowly towards electronic media, television. In those days, digital media was not even heard of. But electronic media already became very powerful, the television, etc. So all electronic media, you must provide a free time to recognized political parties for the campaigning. And the Election Commission can decide how to apportion that time. Then slowly, the campaign itself will move from the current kind of a high cost, low impact, mostly unaccounted expenditure to legitimate expenditure in a very transparent way and reduces the burden on the political parties. That also was incorporated in the law. But the second part was never implemented because they did not frame the rules. The first part was implemented from day one. That is, the contributions to registered political parties are fully tax exempt for the donors. India probably is the only country in the world which has such a law. You can do research. In a country like America, actually, companies are prohibited from funding political parties, though they try to overcome that by so-called super PACs and PACs, political action committees, etc. All kinds of stratagems are employed. And individual contributions in those days were limited to $2,700. You cannot contribute more than $2,700. So not only is there no incentive to fund, there's actually a serious restriction. Later in the Citizens United case, the Supreme Court of the United States went too far and said, you cannot impose any kind of a burden. Anything is okay. It's part of freedom of speech. Therefore, you can spend any amount of money on political campaigns. So right now, there's a bit of a mess in American political campaign finance. But when we did this, India was the only country among major democracies that actually incentivized funding to political parties by tax exemptions. So it was in that sense a very sensible law, very necessary law. But two caveats. One, I never had the illusions that this would solve the problem of money in politics, because most of the money in politics is not the transparent money or accounted money or money spent on legitimate political activity. Most Indian expenditure by political parties and candidates is illegitimate money spent illegitimately, or at least unaccounted money spent illegitimately for vote buying, and many other nefarious activities. So, first of all, let's understand the limitations. The second problem is there is a fear in our country that if you are seen to be inimical to the government of the day, if you are opposed to the government, if you supported an opposition party or an opposition candidate, then the government in power can destroy you economically. You take United States, you may be Mark Zuckerberg, or you may be Bill Gates, or you may be Tesla's Elon Musk, or somebody else. There is nothing that the government can do if you fund another party. If all these bigwigs they fund, let's say Republican Party, a Democratic president can do nothing to hurt them. If they fund a Democratic Party candidate, the Republican Party can do nothing to hurt them because they really instituted a framework of rule of law where you're invulnerable. At the most, you may not be invited for a White House dinner. That's personal. Otherwise, they can't really affect your economic fortunes. But in India, rule of law is only on paper. Everybody knows that if the government of the day is unhappy with you at the state level or national level, they can really make your life miserable in terms of business. So there is a fear.
Yes, sir.
The reason why Mr. Arun Jaitley has gone for this secrecy, it is wrong. And it is violating basic principle of transparency, but there is an underlying reason. Mr. Jaitley himself told me several times between 2004 when they lost power and 2014 when they regained power, the BJP NDA. He said, look, you worked so hard to make this law happen. Mr. L.K. Advani gave a directive to us that now that there is a tax exemption to the donors, why should you receive cash? After all, the party does not require any cash. We only require legitimate funding for legitimate purposes. Let's only collect by check. Remember, they were in power at that time. NDA was in power. Despite that, the moment he gave that direction and the party implemented that, their contributions to the party fell by 80 to 90%, I believe.
Oh.
Even when you're in power. That means the donors are not willing to give in a transparent check.
Yes, sir.
Even when tax exemption is available. Because they're afraid of retribution. They're afraid of nuisance value. They say, you gave them 1 crore, give us 1 crore. Some other fellow will create a nuisance value. But even more than that, there is a fear that a future government of a different persuasion may harass you, humiliate you, or destroy you economically. So the real challenge is, how do you address that? Mr. Jaitley went for this secret bonds issue. This is an ugly compromise because of a real problem. The problem is real. Don't underestimate the problem. So being a clever lawyer, he tried to combine two objectives. One is, how do you ensure that there is actually accounted funding, not unaccounted illegitimate funding, and funding by check for legitimate purposes. But how do you protect the anonymity and the secrecy of the donor so that he or she is not afraid to contribute? So for that, he came up with the secret electoral bond, but by check, and the party gets the money. The money that the party gets is accounted, but where from it is coming is not accounted. So this is an ugly compromise for a real problem. While the Supreme Court judgment is necessary and there is no other judgment possible, unless we actually understand what is happening in terms of financing of political parties and the fear of retribution if the source of contribution is known, unless the larger rule of law is altered, and unless the economic fortunes of an enterprise or individual, they are not affected by the political party. And that's going to take a long time. It will not happen tomorrow by an order. It will take another 10, 20 years to create a new culture where you may oppose me, but you have a right to do your business as long as you compete in the market fairly and succeed. Your life is yours. You are a wealth creator. And I will not use my political power to hurt you. You must create the rules and the legal framework, but you must also create a political culture to ensure that happens. Until that time, all that will happen is the money that's now coming by check will go underground as cash. The second, even bigger problem is, what about the 80 to 90% money that is coming into politics for vote buying and other illegal activities? The answer does not lie in somehow providing that money. The answer lies in removing the need for that money altogether. Because our democracy is completely distorted. It's not distorted by somebody getting 1 crore rupees for legitimate campaigning. It's completely distorted if somebody spends tens of crores of rupees to buy the votes. It's creating an entry barrier. It's making it impossible for you to honestly run politics. Even if you're individually honest, institutionally you have to be dishonest in order to sustain this politics of illegitimate money. And it's making people the slaves of parties and candidates instead of being other way around. And men and women of distinction and genuine competence and public interest in their hearts, they really are not able to compete politically. The first question any party asks, let's be truthful, in most of the states, if people want to be a candidate for assembly or parliament, is how much money can you spend? They're not saying what are your credentials, why do you think you are fit to be a legislator, what is the public service record. They're not asking all that. They're saying how much money can you spend. So unless that is altered, nothing significant will change. So I welcome it, but I don't think it's going to be a game changer because, in India we have this breathless excitement. A revolution has taken place, a landmark judgment. But it's not true. It's a good judgment, the only judgment possible, but the bigger political reform in terms of funding is critically necessary, and in terms of making industry invulnerable to political vagaries. That means you can survive in business without the government's blessings. And even with the government's antagonism, we must create that framework, and India has a long way to go.
So how do you think a rational, informed voter should view and respond to these electoral bonds?
Many informed voters are not comfortable with that. They don't want secret funding. Most voters don't care or don't understand. And very few people actually go deeper and look at the bigger party finances issue. Because the Indian political funding issue is not a campaign finance issue. In the West, typically the word used is campaign finance and campaign finance reform, because the money in politics is to reach the message. What is campaign? To reach the message to the voters. In India, that is not really the big issue. In India, the real issue is the vote buying and other nefarious, illegal activities, which should be eliminated altogether by changing the incentives. It's not a funding problem. So, I don't think even otherwise well-educated people really understand the detail. Most of us, we don't have time and attention to pay. And we are busy with our own lives, our professions and careers. And therefore, we pay a fleeting attention to what is happening. We come to a snap judgment and we move on.
So, if not for electoral bonds, what would your ideal model be for funding of political parties?
There is no other model except contributions. We must create a framework in which contributions are encouraged. Some people, including Dinesh Goswami committee, Indrajit Gupta committee, they had some old-fashioned ideas that government will fund political parties. It is unrealistic. Whom do you fund? How do you fund? How much do you fund?
Exactly.
And will it actually make a difference? In a culture of India, government funds, let's say 2,000 crores from the exchequer, it will still continue. The 2 lakh crores expenditure will still continue. On what basis to fund? One realistic approach is if you are a recognized political party, like in Germany, for instance, the parties get a certain amount per vote, X amount, for running the party. It's not enough for the campaigns, but it sustains the political party. It's possible only if you're a recognized party, obviously, and certain tweaks are possible. In fact, we recommended that also in 2003, but India is far from that stage. But that funding will be limited just to run the party. Frankly, I don't think it's even necessary. See, what is a political party? What is leadership? If you are a leader, you must have powerful ideas to shape our collective future as a country, as a state, as a locality, right? So you must be able to inspire me, inspire us, the voters and the donors. If I feel that Jasha is a wonderful leader, she has great ideas, and her ideas are important for my life and our community, then I will support you. If you have no capacity as a leader to inspire me and to get support from me, to raise contributions through that inspiration and support, then why should the country fund you? Just because somebody has an ambition to be in the assembly or parliament, is it the duty of the taxpayer to fund you? Because of our socialist mindset, the notion that everything should be funded by the government, many people intuitively, without even thinking, say, let the government fund. It's not a realistic option. The only realistic option is that you create a framework in which the individuals incentivized. That's what the tax exemption is about. And we must create a framework in which the corporates are not afraid to fund anybody who they believe is good for the country or the economy, and there will not be any consequences. And three, you probably can create a framework in which a large number of small contributions become dominant instead of a small number of large contributions. In the US, for instance, there is actually public funding. Many people may not realize it for the presidential elections, both primaries and the final election. But it's contingent upon you receiving a large number of small donations. If you get one contribution of $1 million, you will not get any public funding. But if you get, let's say, 100,000 contributions each of $10 or $20, then you're entitled to public funding. Therefore, the law and the rules, they incentivized collection of a large number of small donations. Some such thing we should consider. But apart from that, already Indian law provides for a robust incentive. There is, as I said, no large democracy to the best of my knowledge, which gives a full tax exemption to the donor for political funding. So I don't see much more is necessary or possible, except the things that I mentioned, encouraging small contributions on a large scale, so on and so forth. But as somebody who has some understanding of elections, let me assure you, if the election cost or the political cost is only running an office and reaching the message to people, there is enough money in the system, honestly. The real problem is not the campaign in India, as I mentioned before. The real problem is vote buying and other illegitimate activities. Now, these are not issues where the question of where will the money come is relevant. The only question there is, how do you eliminate those that need at all? Not how do you find the money for that. That's a terrible question. That means you want to perpetuate a horrid system. So the problem is not so much money in politics, legitimate money for legitimate politics. The problem is the incentive for illegitimate expenditure. There is inexhaustible appetite for illegitimate funds in politics. That's a different question altogether. We confuse the two, combine the two.
So you would agree that electoral bonds are not the correct answer?
Absolutely. There has to be, in principle, transparent funding. No question about it. But it doesn't solve the problem because of the reasons I mentioned.
Yes, sir. So we have to also look at a framework that protects the donors as well.
In the long term, it doesn't happen overnight, it doesn't happen by law. You have to create a political culture in which a donor is not afraid, no matter whom I fund, my future is secure. Nobody can touch me. Right. That confidence must be engendered in the system. It will not happen by a law or rules. Just because you say something will not happen. Because we have a political economy where the economic fortunes of enterprise are completely dominated by the political party in power. And that will change only over a long period. And the political parties must abstain from this kind of vulgar approach that you didn't support me, therefore I'll hurt you. Yes. That is wrong morally and legally, but who cares? It's happening all the time.
Yes, sir.
So, and it takes a long time to create a new culture where your political views, your political support will not in any way influence my decision making in respect of you. That there is a real rule of law. I treat you equal to anybody else. If we believe that that is happening today, we are lying to ourselves. That is not true in India today. And that will take a long time to inculcate.
Yes, sir. All right. Thank you, sir.